Everyone, welcome to Time with the Bible Live. We have been doing these Friday studies for quite a while, but we've been going through and looking at the Gospels, talking about Jesus and getting to know him better. So if you would turn your Bibles over to Mark chapter 3, we're going to spend most of our time in Mark 3. This morning's lesson will probably be, or our study will be a little bit shorter than what they usually are, but we're going to look at Jesus choosing his apostles. And it's interesting the type of people that Jesus decided to have around him, the type of people that he wanted around him. We'll talk about that as we get into this. But we're in Mark chapter 3. I'm going to read starting there in verse 13, and we'll go to verse 19. It says, he went up on the mountain, called to him those he himself wanted. And they came to him, and he appointed the 12 that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach and have the power to heal sickness and to cast out demons. Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Barjonas. This is sons of thunder, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him. And they went into a house. So we'll stop right there. So Jesus goes up on top of a mountain, and he called 12 men to himself. It's interesting. I think the other account said that he spent the night on top of the mountain praying. Now, Jesus often spent very pivotal moments in his career, in his ministry. He often spent them in prayer, especially before he made very important decisions. And this was going to be a huge decision. He's choosing 12 men to be his close companions. And look what he calls them for. He says, so that they might be with him. He's probably talking about some kind of training mission, that they were going to be the ones who would be around him more than the other disciples would, that they would learn his ways. Actually, in the Jewish society, disciples would often follow around their rabbis, and they would soak in their teachings and their ways, and they would try to mimic and be just like their rabbis. And so that's really what this is going to be. And it says to send them out. They were going to be representatives of Jesus on this earth, who are going to spread his message. And in fact, that word send out there is actually the word for apostle. An apostle means someone who is sent out. It's talked about in a generic sense, people who were sent out, Paul and Barnabas, who's not one of the 12. Barnabas is called an apostle, but he was an apostle of the church at Antioch because they were both sent out by the church at Antioch. They weren't apostles in the official sense, like the ones that Jesus chose here, but they were apostles in the sense that they were sent out. Now, these 12 were going to be the ones he would send out in an official position as an apostle. You know, Jesus knows he's not going to be around forever. He knows that his time on this earth is going to be really short, and he's going to need representatives, and that's who they were going to be. They were going to have the power to heal, cast out demons. Like there's more than enough work to go around. They were going to pick up his work. Everything that Jesus had done previously was what they were going to be called to do, and they were going to continue to do. And think about this, you know, if you were to start this mission, this worldwide mission, what kind of people would you choose? Like if you were going to begin a very important mission, you'd probably choose people who are educated, people who were the best. They were the most trained, the ones who had the most ability. You know, you'd probably want to choose those who are stable or those who had status in society when, like, the United States chooses representatives to go into other nations. They are the top notch. They are the most educated. They are high status people. Uh, but it's interesting, Jesus doesn't choose those kind of people. And as we just kind of break down the list and we look at the men that he did choose, they were kind of the common people. Just look at a few of them. Think about Peter, Andrew, James, and John, 4 fishermen. Acts later on, when they stand before the Sanhedrin, it says they saw that they were untaught and unlearned. Like, they didn't go to the rabbi schools. They were just your common everyday fishermen. And you think about Peter himself. Peter, who would deny Jesus and who would later struggle to understand that the kingdom was more than just for the Jews, but it was also for the apostles. And not only did he even struggle through it, as God gave him 3 visions, teaching him what he made unclean, he can make clean. But even later on in Galatians, we see that he was still struggling with it as he refused to eat with the Gentiles. And Paul had to stand him, face to face. That's the kind of man. You think about Peter. Peter just, he was a very kind of rash person. He didn't know much self-control. He said things when he shouldn't say things. He said things he shouldn't say. He'd say things before he really understood things. So Peter was one of those people. He also chose Matthew. And if you know anything about Matthew is a tax collector. If Jesus was concerned about his reputation, and if he was concerned about what people thought of the mission that he was going to send these people on, he would have avoided somebody like Matthew. Because tax collectors were thought of to be thieves, and they were thought of as just slimy type people. But Jesus chose a tax collector as an apostle, as one of those that would be closest to him. Then you think about a man like Simon. Simon was, politically, he was a zealot. And that just kind of means that he was an extremist. He was kind of the terrorist of the day. He hated the Roman government. He just wanted to slit all their throats and run them out of town. And they would go into extreme measures sometimes, and trying to rid the Roman government. So that's Simon. You think about another man in this list. You think about Peter. You think about Thomas. If somebody says Thomas, what do they think of? A lot of times we think of a doubting Thomas, because that's just become a name, but it's really representative of his character. He doubted that Jesus was resurrected from the dead, despite Jesus telling him at least five times that he was going to go to Jerusalem, suffer, die, and be resurrected from the dead. That he wouldn't believe it until he touched the hands and the side of Jesus. And so Thomas is known to be a doubter. You think about other people like Philip, who was often slow to grasp things. But as you go through the list, there's one that stands out the most to me. And that is, as you get down to verse 19, Judas Iscariot. When you think of Judas, like, what do you think of? And how many Judases do you know? I don't know any Judases, because most parents understand that's not a name that you'd want to name your child. But Judas Iscariot was, as he points out, was the betrayer. His reputation was that he was a thief, and that he was he was a man who was greedy, and he saw an opportunity to sell Jesus. And he was also a man who, when he realized what he had done, he also committed suicide. Those are the men that Jesus chose. And you think about them as a whole. The amazing part about the Gospels is that the Gospel writers, they don't try to cover any of that up. They just lay it out as it is. These are the type of men that Jesus chose. They were constantly struggling to grasp greatness, arguing over who would be the greatest. They were constantly not grasping what Jesus was trying to teach them. And, as a group, they just seem to doubt and they seem to struggle to understand some of the greatest things. So you think about those men. Would those men be the men that you would choose? Would you choose men like that? And why? And if not, you think about, why would God choose people like that? Well, I would think about something, that these men were a mess, but we're all a mess. Like, the only thing that makes us special is God's mercy and God's grace. And God's mercy and his grace can help us become better people, can help us become better. And you think about maybe some reasons why God chose these men. He probably chose people like this so that they would glorify him more. You think about throughout history, the people that God chose to do his work. I believe it's Micah, one of the prophets, one of the minor prophets, that was just a shepherd. God chose a shepherd to go and bring his message to his people, to bring to Israel, to bring before kings. The prophets were just nobodies from nowhere. They were a humble people, but God chose them to be his messengers. You think about men like David, a young man who God chose to send before Goliath, who stood up to this monstrous of a man, this huge giant of a man. You think about Moses. And even though Moses spent time in Pharaoh's palace, and he grew up there, by the time Moses comes on the scene to deliver God's people, what was he? Acts 7 says he was a failed deliverer. That when he had gone out, he thought it was his time to go and deliver the Israelites, and he was rejected. They said, who makes you our judge? And then he runs out into the country, and he becomes a shepherd for 40 years. He's an 80-year-old failed deliverer who is just a shepherd that God calls at the burning bush to come deliver his people. He's a nobody. You think about Gideon, when God called Gideon, and God called him a mighty warrior, but Gideon says, "Who am I? Who am I that God would choose me to go and deliver his people from the Canaanites?" That's exactly what Moses' message was. God told him to go deliver his people, and how many excuses did he give until he finally just said, "Find somebody else. I'm not your person." And God says, "No, you go." And you think about all these apostles, they're just nobodies from nowhere. So why does he choose that kind of person? I think 1 Corinthians chapter 1, and even 1 Corinthians chapter 1, as you go into chapter 3, you see that God often chose that which the world considered to be foolish and nothing. He chose them so that he would be glorified. In verse 31, at the very end of 1 Corinthians 1, after he says that he chose the foolish things of the world, he says, so that he who glories, let him glory in the Lord, so that he'll be glorified. I think it also shows God's power in bringing this message by unlearned men. Like, it wasn't the philosophers, it wasn't the religious elite. A man like Nicodemus would go to God, who was a ruler of the Jews, who came to him by night, who said, I believe that you're from God. And God says, hey, you got to start all over. Like, you can't use your position to think that you're going to be somebody great, somebody mighty in my kingdom, but instead you've got to be born again. You got to start all over. In fact, I think part of it is that if he had chose the rulers of the world, if he chose the religious elite, then it wouldn't show much of his power. Then maybe those men, maybe others would think that the power was found in them, in the rulers. But instead, he chose these men, and it just proved that you could just tell it was God's success. And so they would, like in Acts chapter 3, after Peter and John had healed the lame man, Peter says, "Why are you looking at me?" Like, God's the one that just healed him. Yes, he used me, but God's the one that healed him. So it shows God's power more when it's untaught, unlearned people. And another reason he chose these men, with the exception of Judas, the reason he chose these men was because they're loyal. Like, they weren't much. Like, on the outside and in their character, they just weren't much. But they were loyal. And you see, God can do something with loyal people. He has accomplished great things with loyal people. Another thought I had as well is that God knew that he can change them. Like, you think about these men, where they began, the things that we know, like all the mess that they were. But then you think about who they became. And we know a couple of them. You think about Peter. Peter went from this kind of rash man who denied God and like struggled to have faith in really difficult times and struggled through God's learning to trust God's way. And then you read First Peter, and he says, in those trials, it's like gold going through fire. He's like, hold on to God, don't let go of him. And then in Second Peter, he says, it's not enough just to have faith. So First Peter's like, you got to hold on to your faith. Don't let go of your faith. Don't do what I did. Then in Second Peter, you have him teaching that you got to add to your faith. You got to grow. You got to develop. In fact, Second Peter, he says that he's an old man, and that if there was one thing that he could tell them, and he would tell them over and over again, it's add to your faith virtue, knowledge, self-control, perseverance, godliness, brotherly kindness, and love. And you go through that, and he says that was his deathbed sermon. That was like the summary of everything that he had learned in his growth in the Lord. Then you think about John, who is one of the sons of thunder. Him and James and John were the sons of thunder, who wanted to completely destroy a city because they rejected Jesus. And Jesus taught them compassion. And by the time you get to his epistles, John goes from the sons of thunder to the apostle of love. Completely changed and who he was and his mentality. And so God can change even the person that is messed up in this life. God can change you, and that's where God's power is found. And so, I think one of the lessons we can learn is that when we go to look for people to follow Jesus, what kind of people are we looking for? Are we looking for people that are just educated? People that have status? Are we looking for those who are capable and talented? Are those the only kind of people that we're looking for? Are we, God? I think God's more concerned with spiritual qualities than he is about those physical things. So I think that's it's kind of cool to go through this list and look at these people and think about the kind of people that God chose and the purposes, the reason that God chose people like that. I think God had an end goal. He was trying to teach us something about the kingdom, that it isn't the people that God always, or that the world looks at as the great, the educated, the philosophers. Many times it's the humble, it's the common person, because most of the time those who are of status in this world, they cling to it, and they struggle to grasp that what the kingdom's about. The kingdom's about sacrificing self. And that's harder for people that have status in this world, have success in this world. And we got to guard ourselves against that. It doesn't mean that people of success don't obey the gospel. They certainly do. But the challenge, there's lots more challenges there, like the rich young ruler and others. All right, those are my thoughts regarding this. If you have any other thoughts that you have regarding this passage and some things that you think about when you think about God choosing these men, if you have any thoughts or comments, please feel free. Comment down below, and I'll always go back. I'll try to check later to see if any comments were made, and we can have a discussion. This was a question. I'm sorry that your name didn't come through, but it says, would the murderers of Jesus have been a likely candidate? Peter thought so. Oh, Mike. Okay. Yeah. I mean, exactly. On the day of Pentecost, the very people who had put Jesus on the cross and had cried out, crucify him, were the very people that Peter preached the gospel to, and that were cut to the heart and obeyed the gospel. Yeah, it's remarkable what God can do with even people who have rejected God in their life. When their hearts are softened, God can do great things. Amen. All right, thank you, Mike. I appreciate that comment. Yeah, if you have any other comments, feel free. If you didn't get the beginning part, please feel free to go back and rewatch it. The recording should be on there for you to go back and reference at any point. Appreciate everybody who participated, everybody who took part and studied along with me. And everybody have a great day. God bless.